She stares out from the canvas, eternally composed. Her dress, once a vibrant crimson, has dulled to the deep red of dried blood, its silk folds pooling like a wound across her lap. A jeweled cross rests on her chest, half ornament, half accusation. Her eyes are the most unsettling feature. Not lifeless, not warm, but knowing, as if she has seen everything and already judged it unworthy. The painting hangs in a private gallery now, behind glass and velvet rope, in a forgotten wing of a crumbling estate. Few seek it out, fewer still linger before it. Those who do rarely forget her face. Some call her a queen. Others refuse to speak her name at all. To the villagers who still live near the ruins of her ancestral home, she was a curse-made flesh, a storm dressed in jewels. She died centuries ago, but the silence she left behind is louder than any voice. Historians argue over her. Some dismiss the tales as medieval hysteria, fueled by political enemies and misogynistic rumors. Others point to eyewitness accounts, court records, testimony given through cracked teeth and broken minds. There are names, many names, of those who vanished behind the walls of her estate and were never seen again. There are lists of those who returned, mutilated and voiceless. There are whispers, preserved in brittle letters and church archives, of unspeakable rituals conducted beneath the chapel floor. The truth, perhaps, lies not in any document or artifact, but in the contradiction itself. The impossible duality of one woman who could wear pearls to mass in the morning and order a girl's fingers flayed by evening. A woman who held power in a time when women were meant to be silent, and used it not to inspire but to annihilate. Her name, when it is spoken, conjures a chill. She is remembered not for her laws or her reign or her lineage, but for something deeper, something more primal. Horror. It clings to her legacy like mold on stone. And yet the painting is beautiful. That's the part that disturbs people most. She is not rendered as monstrous. There are no dark shadows or serpents, no hints of madness in her pose. She looks, instead, like any queen might, serene, regal, delicate. The artist captured her, as she wished to be remembered, composed, invincible, untouched by time or judgment. But look closer. The background is too dark. The candlelight flickers wrong. The hands are folded with just a bit too much pressure, as though holding something down, and the eyes, they follow. They always follow. There are legends, of course there are, that she bathed in blood to preserve her youth, that her screams still echo in the dungeons when winter fog settles low, that her estate is cursed and crops rot faster in the shadow of its gates. But legends are what people build when truth is too terrible to speak plainly. The reality, as it often is, was both less and more than the stories. This queen did not bathe in blood. She collected it, studied it, measured it. She kept records, notebooks filled with tallies, notes on behavior, endurance, silence. She was not a madwoman who lashed out in rage. She was a scientist of suffering, a theologian of pain. And yet she wrote prayers every morning before she began her day. She knelt beneath a wooden crucifix and whispered scripture. She fasted during Lent. She gave generously to orphanages and hospitals, though some would later question what became of those donations. She kissed the hands of bishops and bowed before relics. Her piety was unquestionable. Her soul, she claimed, was clean. This is what haunts those who study her, not just the acts themselves, but the clarity with which she performed them, the ritual, the devotion, the way cruelty and divinity coexisted within her without contradiction. She was, by all accounts, a devoted wife, a patron of the arts, a sharp diplomat. She strengthened borders, suppressed rebellion, and improved infrastructure. The kingdom prospered under her watch, but it bled underneath her, and so we begin not with her birth, nor her crimes, nor her death, but with the portrait, because it captures what no document can: the contradiction, the beauty and the horror. The gaze of a woman who was both queen and executioner, mother and monster. To understand her, we must go back beyond the paint, beyond the palace, beyond the carefully curated myths to the snow-covered forests where her bloodline first took root, a land of wolves and whispers, where her name was first spoken in dread, long before she drew her first breath. Because some women are not born, they are summoned. Before she was queen, before she had a crown or a name worth remembering, she belonged to a house few dared to speak of openly except in hushed tones and at a safe distance. It was not one of the great dynasties, not old enough to boast Roman roots or wide enough to spread its fingers across half a continent. But what it lacked in grandeur, it made up for in hunger. The house of Droshkow had ambition, and it had teeth. They ruled a frozen corner of Eastern Europe forests, so thick they swallowed sound, rivers that froze to the marrow, fields that yielded more bones than grain. It was not a land that welcomed children, and yet into this world a girl was born, under a moonless sky, while wolves howled just beyond the torch-lit tree line. Her birth was said to be difficult. Her mother bled for hours, and the midwife's hands shook from cold and fear. The child did not cry. She opened her eyes and stared. The priest who christened her later confessed he felt watched. The family crest was a wolf's head, jaws open. The motto beneath: loyal in pack, savage alone. Fitting for a house that trusted no one, not even itself. Her father was a count by title, a drunk by habit, a man made small by his own violence. He'd fought in border skirmishes and returned with both a limp and a fury he never managed to put down. He carried a switch with him at all times, not to walk with, but to remind his children, for boys and one girl, that obedience was never a suggestion. Her mother, by contrast, never raised her voice. She preferred silence as a weapon. Her punishments came through absence, cold stares, long fasts imposed for perceived insolence. She trained her daughter with the precision of a falconer feeding affection in crumbs, withdrawing it entirely at the first sign of softness. Love, she once said to the child, is the bait they use to cage you, better to be feared. The girl learned early not to flinch. She learned to hold eye contact until the person looking away wasn't her. She learned that pain was not to be avoided, but studied, measured, understood. The castle she grew up in, less a palace than a stone beast with broken wings, was always cold. Not just in weather, but in spirit. It had corridors that led nowhere, doors that hadn't opened in decades, and a tower that everyone avoided. No one explained why. Servants kept their heads down. Fireplaces remained empty in the girls' chambers as punishment for unspoken offenses. Food was withheld for minor disobediences. Privacy was a fantasy. She befriended the dogs in the kennels, half-wild things that bit stable boys and tore geese to shreds. She watched how they followed her, not out of affection, but recognition. She belonged to the pack. Outside, the forest offered a different kind of education. It was said to be haunted. Old villagers claimed that witches lived among the trees, that ancient gods slept beneath the roots, that the wind sometimes whispered in languages no longer spoken. The girl listened. She knew the difference between superstition and threat, she wasn't afraid of ghosts. Only people scared her. Her brothers cruel, brash, and largely mocked her for her quietness. They learned too late that silence could be a blade. One by one, they were sent away to join military ranks or cloisters. All of them failed to thrive. 2 died before reaching adulthood. The girl, however, remained. Her father said she was too clever to trust, too cold to love, and too dangerous to let go. At age 7, she was caught dissecting a mouse. At 10, she asked the priest what happened to souls caught in purgatory. Could they scream? Could anyone hear them? At 12, she locked a maid in the pantry for an entire night for breaking. Her comb then denied it with a calm that unsettled even the steward. The only praise she ever received came when she lied well. Her mother taught her that truth was a liability. Her father taught her that pain was instruction. Together, they built a daughter who understood the world not as a series of relationships, but of leverage points. People, she was taught, were instruments. Bend them before they break, and break them before they betray. There was no warmth in her upbringing, no softness, no comfort, only rules, obedience, and watching, always watching. She watched how fear changed people, how weakness smelled, how silence made people confess things they hadn't yet said aloud. It was in this crucible of cold stone and colder hearts that the girl who would one day wear a queen's crown first learned her truest inheritance, the language of control. And though the world beyond the forest would not yet know her name, it had already begun to feel her coming. The soil of Drashko drank blood easily. The snow covered the bones without a trace. And the wolves they always knew when one of their own had been born. She was 15 when the papers were signed, a ceremonial gift to a man more than twice. Her age a king without a dynasty, seeking legitimacy in the bloodline of wolves. The court called it a great match, a merging of lands and loyalty. He was a ruler of fractured realms and perpetual battles, respected more for the sharpness of his sword than the steadiness of his crown. She was young, beautiful, unreadable, silent in all the right moments, the perfect bride for a kingdom that needed the illusion of harmony. The wedding was held in winter, when the snows made travel perilous and the mountain passes silent. She wore white, not because it symbolized purity, but because it made her easier to see against the gloom. Her veil was heavy with pearls. She never smiled. The king was not cruel, not in the way she would later become, but he was indifferent. He kissed her cheek like one would greet a statue, and handed her over to his steward. The marriage was consummated behind locked doors, beneath tapestries of saints being flayed alive. She bled. She did not cry. In the early days, she tried. She spoke softly to the older ladies of court. She sent handwritten letters to her husband during his military campaigns. She lit candles in the chapel and prayed for affection. But the court had no use for her kindness, only her image. They wanted her to look regal, not to act. Her husband wrote rarely and never addressed her directly. He preferred the company of generals, diplomats, and women with names that changed. Each season, she was kept in the East Wing, lavish but distant. The windows were tall but sealed. The corridors echoed. The maids were rotated frequently, their mouths tightly shut. There were no confidants, no warmth, just ceremonial duties, and the silence of powerlessness. And yet she watched, always watching. She learned the rhythm of court life, the gossip that flowed through corridors like smoke, the alliances traded over wine, the hidden loathing beneath compliments. She became fluent in the politics of glances and posture. She memorized the names of ministers, children, the drinking habits of the generals, the mistresses her husband favored and discarded. She played her role perfectly quiet, dignified, obedient, but inside, the hollowness was growing. She had been starved of affection all her life, and now she found herself surrounded by finery and utterly alone. No one touched her without reason. No one spoke to her without purpose. The crown she wore was light, but the isolation it brought was crushing, and yet something else began to stir in that loneliness. A cold clarity, a realization that love was not required for influence, that visibility could be weaponized, that obedience could be a mask, not a chain. In the long, empty hours of her isolation, she began to test small boundaries. A maid who whispered too loudly was reassigned to the stables. A dressmaker who failed to flatter her taste was dismissed without explanation. A small, frightened page boy who spilled wine on her glove was sent back to his family, his wages docked, his father's taxes mysteriously raised. None of it was cruel in the open, but each act was precise, deliberate, quiet. She did not shout. She did not strike. She simply removed. The court took notice, but said nothing. They saw in her the same calculating detachment they had once admired in her husband. They underestimated her, of course. They thought her coldness a symptom of neglect, not a strategy. They assumed she was withering in solitude, but she was, in truth, sharpening. Behind locked doors, she read philosophy, scripture, law. She asked her tutors unsettling questions. How much pain the human body could withstand before death, whether God forgave those who inflicted suffering for the sake of order, whether a queen could issue punishments outside the purview of the courts if they remained secret. No one answered her directly, but she kept the silence and drew her own conclusions. The crown on her head meant little, at first ceremonial, ornamental, but in time it became something else entirely. A shell, a casing, a mask. She wore it well, and while her husband rode off to win battles in faraway fields, she remained in the palace quiet, dutiful, patient, waiting. The East Wing had a garden. It was not the grand palace garden where courtiers strolled. Peacocks roamed, and sculpted fountains whispered in the heat of summer. No, this one was hidden, walled off, overgrown, and steeped in silence. The stones were uneven, the hedges too high, the soil poor. Roses grew wild here, their thorns unchecked. Ivy clung to crumbling statues. A half-forgotten marble bench stood beneath a blackened yew tree. Its roots split like veins. She claimed the space as her own. Servants were not permitted to enter unless summoned. And when they were, they came quietly, with eyes lowered and hands trembling. At first, it seemed harmless. Enough. A place for the queen to find solitude, her own corner of the world, untouched by courtly demands. She spent long hours there sitting, pacing, watching the insects crawl between broken flagstones. But over time, the garden changed, or perhaps it simply reflected what was changing in her. Her isolation had turned bitter. What had once been patient silence now fermented into something more dangerous, craving for control. And with her husband away for months at a time, the court indifferent, and the ministers content to let her disappear into ceremony, there was no one to stop what bloomed in her shadow. The punishments began quietly. A maid who dropped a porcelain dish was made to kneel in the snow for an hour, her hands bare, her knees bruising on stone. Another, who failed to button her bodice correctly, was sent into the garden barefoot to pick thorns from the hedgerows by hand. One servant was instructed to hold a candle aloft for so long that the wax ran down her arm and seared her skin. "It is discipline," the queen said when asked. Nothing more. She kept a book, a ledger, names, offences, punishments. She wrote in it with ink the colour of dried blood. Her entries were neat, precise. Occasionally she sketched little diagrams, posture, corrections, hand placements, ways to restrict movement without bruising too visibly. No one dared confront her directly. The court whispered behind tapestries, exchanged glances in the corridors. But in public, the queen remained composed. She prayed at mass. She greeted guests. She smiled with just enough restraint to seem dignified. And so they told themselves stories. She is simply strict. She's a perfectionist. She was raised in the old ways, harsh but effective. The truth was harder to accept. The queen was no longer content to be feared silently. She was beginning to enjoy the power. She issued new rules for the palace staff. All maids must remain silent in her presence. Any errors in presentations, misaligned seams, poorly tied hair were to be punished. Meals were to be served with heads bowed and eyes averted. Those who disobeyed were not dismissed. They were kept because dismissal was too simple. It lacked impact. Soon, the garden became her stage. She ordered specific punishments to be carried out there, where she could watch. She would sit beneath the yew tree in a velvet cloak, sipping wine, while girls wept silently among the thorns. They were told not to scream. Screaming made it worse. Some were made to hold books in outstretched arms until their shoulders collapsed. Others forced to wear rough cloths soaked in brine across raw skin. One was ordered to kneel in the nettles for 2 hours without moving. When she fainted, she was revived with icy water and told to begin again. She framed it all as morality. Correction, a queen, she said, must mould her court. She quoted scripture discipline as virtue, pain as purification. She likened herself to a mother scolding wayward children. But her words were lies in lace. Her pleasure was evident in the way her eyes lingered on trembling hands, the way she tapped her fingers when a punishment took too long to break someone. There were rumors, of course. Some believed the punishments were exaggerated. Others whispered that the queen was simply practicing what had been done to her, that this was not cruelty but inheritance. But those who served her saw the truth. She didn't need to be provoked. It wasn't about justice. It was about spectacle, control, the slow unmaking of a person through ceremony. One maid knew. Naive asked why no one ran. Where would we go? The others said. And who would believe us? And they were right, because outside the garden, the queen was untouchable. Her beauty was preserved in paintings, her piety documented in church ledgers, her political support secured through generous donations and more diplomatic charm. Only those within the walls saw the other woman, the one who clipped roses not for their petals, but to count their thorns. And so the garden grew quieter, the flowers more vibrant, the air heavy with the perfume of lavender, sweat, and fear. By the time her husband returned from his campaigns, the garden had become sacred territory, not in the religious sense, but in the ancient one, a place where blood was offered, where silence was worshipped, where pain bore fruit. And she no longer just a girl in a crown had become something else entirely. It began not with a scream, but with the absence of sound. No music echoed through the palace halls. The laughter of courtiers was replaced by the measured hush of guarded words. Even the birds, once nesting in the eaves, seemed to avoid the stone chambers of the queen's domain. It was as if the very air had been trained to whisper. She spoke rarely now, and only when necessary. Voice, when it came, was soft, measured, cold. There was no need for volume. In her silence lay authority. Fear filled the spaces her words once occupied. Her husband returned from war with a shadow over him, thinner, slower. His hands shook, though he insisted it was fatigue. The court doctors blamed age, stress, bad water from the campaign trail. But behind closed doors, the servants saw more. They saw the sweat-soaked linens, the half-eaten meals, the blood-streaked cloths tossed into fireplaces. He lived less than 6 months after his return. No autopsy was permitted. The queen wept publicly, beautifully. Her mourning was the portrait of grace. Black silks, veiled face, trembling prayers in candlelit chapels. She knelt at the foot of his coffin for hours. Dignitaries praised her composure. The people, seeing her devotion, called her the faithful widow. But in the days that followed his burial, her mourning took on a new form. She issued her first decree as regent the morning after the funeral. A curfew, then another, reassigning palace staff, then another, expanding her authority over court appointments, finances, judicial decisions. One by one, the ministers found their powers stripped and quietly absorbed into the queen's own hands, and none resisted. None dared. Whispers followed her through the corridors, always hushed, always cautious. Some recalled that the king had once jokingly called her his little surgeon, that she'd been fascinated by his old battlefield wounds. Others remembered the wine he never finished the night he collapsed. But there was no proof, only patterns. The court adjusted. People learned to speak carefully, to smile when watched, to disappear when they sensed danger. The queen did not raise her hand or raise her voice, but her displeasure could still bleed you. Some were simply removed. A clerk who had delayed. Her order was found floating face down in a well. A noble woman who mocked the queen's piety died in her sleep. An advisor who had spoken against her reforms developed a sudden paralysis of the tongue. All natural causes, the physicians said. All unfortunate accidents. The real terror settled not in executions, but in anticipation, in the feeling that one was always being observed, judged, silently condemned. The servants suffered most. They moved like ghosts, now light-footed, pale, sleepless. A strange affliction began to spread among them, something no doctor could name. Shaking limbs, hallucinations, sudden outbursts of screaming. One maid was found clawing at her own skin in the garden. Another plunged her hands into scalding water, sobbing that she was cleansing the guilt. The queen said little. When asked, she attributed their suffering to nerves, weak constitutions, spiritual failings. She brought in priests to bless the halls, but not to tend the sick. She increased fasting periods for the staff, demanded more rigorous penance, lengthened chapel vigils. The court physician, an aging man with trembling hands, kept private notes. In them he scribbled theories he never dared voice. Poisons in the water, exposure to fumes, perhaps something administered slowly, through routine. But each time he approached the matter, he looked up to find one of the queen's ladies watching him from the corner of the room. And so the notes remained hidden. He wrote them in Latin, then in cipher, then not at all. The palace had changed. The great halls that once held banquets now echoed with stillness. Rooms once filled with song now hummed with dread. Footsteps were soft. Doors were always closed. Even the firelight seemed to dim in her presence. She ruled not with brutality, but with quiet suffocation, like a room with no air. Her power was not in what she did, but in what people feared she might do. And so her kingdom adjusted. Ministers nodded faster, servants moved slower. Silence became the law. Outside the palace walls, the people continued. Their lives' fields were tilled. Churches opened their doors. The queen was seen rarely, but always respectfully. Her portrait hung in town halls. Her name was spoken with solemnity. But inside the palace, no one said her name at all, because by then it had become dangerous to speak anything. Above a whisper, the older maids warned the younger ones never to take the west corridor after dark. It was not written in any manual, not enforced by any law. But among the palace staff, the instruction passed mouth to mouth like an old prayer. Avoid the west hall. Do not ask about the rooms behind the panels. And never follow the queen's ladies when they walked in pairs, carrying nothing, speaking not a word. Those who broke the rule vanished. There was no ceremony to their absence, no notice, no funerals. Their names were removed from rosters. Their uniforms were burned. Their families received small pensions, sealed with wax, stamped by the royal crest. The official line was always the same: illness, accident, conscription to distant estates. But the other maids knew better. A survivor emerged once. She did not stay long. They found her weeks later in a convent 50 miles from the palace, her eyes cloudy, her speech fractured. She had escaped, though no one ever learned how. She spoke in pieces, out of order, muttering phrases like the hooks, the bowl of teeth, her face in the candle. It was the abbess who recorded her ramblings, smuggling her words to a scribe in the hope that anyone would take them seriously. From these fragments, a picture formed, and it was horrifying. Behind the paneling of the west corridor, past an invisible seam in the wall, lay a room unlike any other in the palace. Stone, not wood, damp and windowless. The ceiling low enough that tall men had to hunch. The floors sloped slightly toward a central drain. Its purpose was not guessed at. It was stained too dark to deny. The chamber contained instruments, not of war, but of theatre. Restraints bolted to the wall. Chains hanging from the rafters. Hooks too small for livestock, too precise for storage. There were chairs, not for sitting, but for binding. Tables that could be tilted. A barrel of salt. A ladle of melted wax. And in one corner, a golden mirror, cracked diagonally across the surface. It was not merely punishment that occurred here. It was performance. The girl claimed through sobs, through scattered phrases that the queen had watched. Sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by her ladies, that she dressed not in mourning robes, but in crimson silks, unwrinkled, unmoved. That she smiled, not with cruelty, but with curiosity, as though she were studying something. Learning. There were candles, she said. Always candles, arranged in perfect circles, then scattered like constellations. Sometimes the queen whispered prayers as she worked. Sometimes she simply hummed. But most chilling was the phrase the maid repeated again and again. She made us eat. At first, no one believed her. Madness was common among the traumatized. But the abbess noted the way her hands trembled when food was served, the way she clutched her stomach when meat was near, and the scars on her forearms ragged. Deliberate told their own story. More than one historian dismissed the chamber. As legend, no architectural records show a room behind the west wing. No plans, no servant ledgers, nothing, but the palace's stonework is thick, layered, irregular, and over time entire wings have been sealed, forgotten, paved over with plaster and politics. The royal guards never spoke of it, but one, on his deathbed, confessed to a priest that he had once heard screams echoing through the west corridor, screams that turned to singing, and then silence. Some argued that the queen was simply mad, that years of political pressure, personal tragedy, and unchecked power decayed her mind, that the chamber was an extension of a diseased psychomanifestation of her need to dominate, humiliate and destroy what she perceived as disobedience. But others believe it was something colder, not madness, not impulse, method. They cite the records of daily punishments signed by her hand, the reports from distant estates that mirrored the same patterns: girls taken, staff reassigned, wings sealed off. They note the queen's obsession with control, her belief that obedience must be absolute, her religious convictions warped into rituals of purification. She saw the chamber not as a place of cruelty, but of correction, a laboratory of loyalty, a crucible in which the disobedient were made pure. It is said she once told a bishop in a moment of unguarded confidence that fear is the closest we may ever come to holiness, that when a servant feared her more than they feared death, she knew they had finally understood devotion. And what of the mirror? No one knows why it stood in that room. Some say it was for the queen, to watch herself as she administered discipline. Others say it was for the victims to see their own transformation. One theory, whispered only in the darkest corners of archival circles, is that the mirror was part of the ritual itself, because control is most complete when the subject watches. Her self-break, the room, if it ever existed, was eventually sealed. The stones were scrubbed, the records burned. The survivor never spoke again after the convent fire, and the abbess who recorded her story was excommunicated under suspicious circumstances. But the palace remains, and in the west corridor, if one listens late at night, the wind is just right and the silence absolute. Some say you can still hear the faint creak of a chain, or the soft, sweet hum of a lullaby with no words at all. The woman in the mirror was no longer a queen, at least not one born of bloodlines and diplomacy. The figure she now saw staring back at her wore a crown of discipline and devotion woven not with gold, but with fear, isolation, and the sharp edge of divine righteousness. At first, the changes were subtle. She began waking at odd hours, pacing her bedchambers in darkness. The maids whispered that she no longer slept. Her eyes, once keen and hawk-like now, shimmered with something stranger. She gazed too long at nothing. Sometimes she spoke to reflections, sometimes to the walls. She began fasting more severely, sometimes refusing food for days, claiming it was the only way to keep sin at bay. Her chaplain begged her to moderate her piety. He vanished the next week, sent, it was said, to a distant monastery for disobedience. But those closest to her knew better. The queen had begun to see betrayal in every act of kindness, every delay, every trembling hesitation. A mispowered cup became treachery, a dropped kerchief became omen. Her palace, already suffocating, now twisted into something worse. Rooms were rearranged to confuse guests. Entire wings were sealed off. All mirrors were removed except one. A single full-length mirror in her private chambers, surrounded by melted wax and incense. There she would kneel for hours. She began to believe the mirror could show impurity. She forced her ladies to stand before it, naked and silent, while she prayed aloud for their sins to be revealed. If a hand twitched, if an eye blinked, if a chest rose too quickly, she took it as confession. They tried to endure, but few succeeded. Several collapsed during the rituals. One girl, just 16, was beaten until her teeth cracked for smiling in the presence of judgment. Another leapt from the window the morning after her trial. The queen watched the bodies carried out without a word. Blood no longer shocked her. In fact, it began to comfort her. She introduced a new rite, the cleansing. At first, it involved water, then cold, then razors. The women were forced to shave themselves under her eye hair, eyebrows, every trace of vanity. One error, one cut, in the wrong place, and they would be made to start again. On some, the scars never faded, but she grew bolder. One evening, she summoned 3 girls and ordered them to peel thin strips of skin from their own arms to cast away the flesh of temptation. Their screams echoed into the night, unanswered by morning. One of them was dead. The queen announced she had been freed. A hush fell across the palace like snow. Her physicians begged her to stop. She replaced them with alchemists, then monks, then no one. She claimed her body had been made incorruptible through divine torment. She demanded that all who served her prove their purity through acts of submission. Punishment became prayer, and still she saw threats everywhere. One by one, her household was purged. Her cousin, the only noble who still dared speak to her, was accused of plotting. He was arrested, tortured, and buried in an unmarked grave. His wife followed a week later. She had smiled too kindly at a servant. The queen began keeping lists, names, dates, gestures, who had spoken, who had hesitated, who had blinked too much. She filled books with suspicion. Foreign envoys who once sought alliance now found reasons to delay visits. One ambassador from the south returned home pale and shaken, having been forced to watch a penance ceremony. His dispatch simply read, "Do not send another. The queen does not govern, she exorcises us." And still she believed herself righteous, pure, appointed. Her letters to other monarchs became strange, full of biblical metaphors, warnings of judgment, veiled threats wrapped in scripture. She warned of plagues, of divine fire, of women who harbored serpents in their hair. Most never responded. One sent a priest to pray for her soul. That priest was found nailed to the doors of the palace chapel, his tongue removed, rosary wound tightly around his neck. Inside the palace, survival meant stillness. The maids no longer looked up. Guards no longer saluted. Her inner circle had shrunk to those too broken or too fanatical to resist, and yet no one could say when, exactly, she had lost her mind. Was it when the mirror first spoke to her? Or when the punishments became ritual? Or had it begun long before, when she buried her husband, when she took the throne, when she tasted control for the first time and found it sweeter than love? By now it hardly mattered. The mirror no longer reflected her image clearly. Its glass was cracked, spiderwebbed from corner to corner. But she still knelt before it each night, whispering prayers to whom no one could say. But those who passed the chamber door said they sometimes heard her voice shaking, not with grief, not with fear, with joy, as if she had finally found something, or someone staring back. Winter came hard that year. The wind howled with the voice of something ancient, and the trees stood bare and crooked like gallows in the frost. Snow draped the hills like burial shrouds, quieting every path, silencing every question. It was the kind of winter that made people vanish into hunger, into madness, into legend, and beneath that snow, the bodies began to accumulate. At first, it was quiet. A shepherd's daughter went missing from the edge of the woods. A trader never returned from the capital. A farmer found a severed hand clutching a rosary in the reeds behind his barn. But in a land where winters killed more surely than blades, the missing were often chalked up to wolves or starvation, until there were too many, until the peasants began whispering of men dressed in black, faceless riders who galloped in silence across the frozen hills, who arrived without footprints and left only smoke behind. Entire hamlets were found, empty fires still burning in the hearths, meals half-eaten on the tables. No bodies, no blood, just absence. And the queen remained silent. She no longer addressed the court. She no longer heard petitions. Instead, she created something new, something even the oldest nobles dared not name aloud: the sanctified order of the lily. On paper, it was a holy garter, pious extension of the crown's will, founded to uphold spiritual and moral order. In truth, it was a death cult in uniform. The men were taken from prisons, orphanages, and monasteries. Broken men, quiet men. They were anointed with wax and blood, sworn to secrecy, and gifted the lily sigillar, white flower embroidered over a crimson heart. They answered to no laws. But hers villagers learned to dread the sound of hooves on snow. The order arrived unannounced. They entered homes without knocking. They took girls first young, healthy, often virgins, then the sick, the deformed, the midwives, then the priests. Anyone who might question, who might speak, who might have seen. They left behind pamphlets in the Queen's hand treatises on sin and sacrifice, copied by monks who wept as they wrote. One such tract warned, "Impurity is a fire that burns unseen. Better to drown a daughter than let her soul rot in flesh." The meaning was clear. Those who resisted were taken to the Queen's palace, once echoing and solemn, now pulsed with movement. Carriages arrived nightly. Not diplomats, not nobles' deliveries. Girls, bound and gagged, were marched through the back halls. Some cried, most didn't. They had already been broken. Some never even made it to the palace. They collapsed en route, buried in anonymous pits along the frost-cracked roads. The royal guards turned away. The priests stayed home. No one dared confront the sanctified lily, not when those who did were found crucified to the village gates naked, frozen there, eyes gouged out and mouths sewn shut with twine. The Queen watched it all from her tower. She had not aged. If anything, she had grown more radiant. Her cheeks flushed, her lips stained crimson. She said little now. She no longer needed to. The land itself had begun to obey her. Her rituals now spilled across the countryside. In town squares, her priests led masses where the people were ordered to confess imagined sins aloud or face the sanctified blade. Children were made to whip themselves with braided cords. Women were shaved and branded with the lily sigil. Men were forced to kneel in snow for hours until their legs turned black and brittle. One by one, the provinces fell into silence. The economy crumbled. Crops failed. Trade routes dissolved. But the Queen no longer sought wealth. She sought order. And in her mind, order could only bloom through pain. Foreign courts watched in horror. Some considered war, but none could justify intervention, at least, not yet. The Queen's decrees spoke of purification, not conquest. And besides, the snow was too thick. the borders too remote. The terrain was death itself. Still, rumors travelled. A duchess from the south described the court as a temple of blood. A deserter from the sanctified Lily arrived at a foreign abbey, raving of what he'd seen girls bled in marble basins, men flayed and offered like sacrifices, and a queen who drank from silver goblets in rooms that stank of iron and incense. The deserter lasted a week before throwing himself from the abbey's roof. The rot had spread too far. By now, even the earth recoiled. The forests stopped bearing fruit. Wolves grew bold, wandering into villages, unafraid. The rivers froze too early and thawed too late. Livestock gave birth to stillborns. The sky, once grey, turned the colour of dried ashdot, and still she smiled. The queen sat each night in her crimson velvet, surrounded by firelight, ink, and silence. She kept a book in her lap, a ledger of names, thousands, each crossed out with a line of red. She believed she was cleansing the world, but even fire consumes its own altar. The palace was now a fortress, a prison of faith and fear, and within it, at the centre of the rot, the queen waited for spring, not to end the suffering, but to begin the next phase. Long after the queen's bones had turned to dust, her name still carried a chill that could silence a room. In the villages surrounding her former estate, elders lowered their voices when mentioning her. Children were warned not to stray near the borders of her lands, not for fear of wolves or thieves, but because the house still listened. Even the air around the manor seemed to resist change, heavy with the breath of the damned. The estate itself, once a symbol of dynastic power, became a mausoleum. Generations of caretakers came and went, often leaving behind cryptic letters or failing to return home altogether. The grand hallway where she had once taken her afternoon walks remained eerily intact. The velvet drapes, though moth-eaten, still clung to the windows, and her infamous crimson gowns were sealed behind glass. Though local superstition claimed that the cloth darkened with fresh stains every decade, but the queen's most intimate heirlooms were her writings pages, scribbled with ink that had faded to a rusty hue, the handwriting wild and irregular. Hidden among the pages of religious texts and household accounts were disturbing glimpses into her mind, diary entries written in a frenzied hand, marginalia in the Psalms with twisted reinterpretations of divine justice, and cold records of punishments dealt made for 1 lash for insolence, 2 for her tears. These writings were not immediately made public. For years they sat sealed in a locked drawer in the estate's tower room. When scholars finally gained access in the 19th century, they expected political correspondence or court gossip. What they found instead were unfiltered ravings, not just of cruelty, but of a mind unraveling by its own design. Survivors of her rule were few, and fewer still spoke of their time in her service. One maid, by then an old woman whose hands never stopped trembling, once whispered to a journalist that the queen would make them eat scraps of their own skin if they tried to flee, shaving it off with broken glass and offering it back as penance. Her account was dismissed as delusion, but 2 decades later, when part of the manor's cellar was excavated, human fingernails were found embedded in the stone walls, too many to be coincidence. Even among royalty, her memory was avoided. Unlike other infamous rulers, she was not given the benefit of historical redemption. No monarch sought to restore her honor. No portraits were restored. Instead, rumors grew that her ghost appeared at the window on cold nights, that her diary pages turned on their own when read aloud, that a certain mirror in her bedroom cracked precisely at midnight every year on the date of her coronation. One of her grandnieces, who inherited part of the family lands, ordered the destruction of the Queen's remaining effects. The gowns were burned, the portraits slashed. The writings, however, were stolen before the fires began. They reappeared decades later in the possession of an aristocratic family known for dabbling in the occult. According to their housekeeper, one letter in particular terrified them, a farewell written in blood, not ink, addressed to no one and signed simply, "The mercy you did not deserve." And then there were the rings, 2 of the Queen's signet. Rings, each adorned with a blood-red garnet, were passed down through separate branches of the family. In both cases, disaster followed. One heir went mad and drowned himself in a frozen river. Another died in a fire that consumed only one room. Of his mansion, his hand, with the ring still on it, the only part left unburned. The rings were eventually donated to a museum, where they remain under glass, though few curators are willing to touch them. Cameras near their display flicker without explanation. A night guard quit after claiming to hear whispering in a language she couldn't recognize. Whether these stories are true or superstition bloomed from centuries of fear hardly matters. What remains undeniable is the pattern. Pain follows her legacy. Her heirlooms do not bring wealth or honor, only loss and decay. And perhaps that was her final triumph, not to be forgotten, but to be remembered in fragments of terror. To live, on not through love or legend, but as a caution, a curse, and a cruel reminder of what happens when power devours the soul. In history's cold archives, she is footnoted, not celebrated. But in the minds of those who know her story, she is unforgettable. A queen not of glory, but of gore. Her kingdom was never defined by borders or banners, but by the unrelenting echo of human suffering she left behind. And though her reign ended long ago, her blood-stained heirlooms ensure that her madness endures. Centuries have passed since the Queen breathed her last breath. The kingdom she once tormented has been renamed, rebuilt, and, in many ways, forgotten. The palaces are gone. The blood has long since dried. And yet her shadow lingers longer, perhaps, than that of any monarch who ruled with mere laws or swords, for hers was a reign not recorded on the throne, but etched into the fear of generations. There are no statues of her in public squares. No national holidays bear her name. Even the royal lineage that followed her seemed to conspire in collective silence. Historians filed her under obscure nobility or minor regent, glossing over the records that spoke of her cruelty. With a kind of practiced delicacy, as though invoking her might somehow summon her back. And yet she endured, not in gilded books, but in whispers, in old houses across Eastern Europe. Grandmothers still murmur bedtime warnings that carry traces of her legend: if you're cruel to others, the Crimson Queen will come for you. In villages too small to show up on modern maps, children dare each other to say her name 3 times in the mirror after dark. They call her the Lady in Crimson, the Queen of Nails, the Mother of Madness, each tale more terrible than the last dot. In Romania, a dilapidated church near her ancestral estate still bears the blackened outline of what locals swear is her image burned into stone, always watching. In Hungary, a weathered statue with no name and no face is adorned every year with a red veil. No one knows who started the tradition or why, but every year someone obeys. Psychologists and scholars have tried to make sense of the fascination. She inspires, She has become a kind of cultural archetype, the feminine terror, the seductive cruelty wrapped in lace. Unlike tyrants who led armies, her weapons were intimacy and proximity. She didn't kill from afar, she hurt those who were required to love her, to serve her. That intimacy is what makes her legend so persistent, so grotesquely memorable. One scholar described her as a phantom, a feminine rage made monstrous by isolation, deference, and unchecked power. Another claimed that the myth of the blood-drinking queen wasn't about historical accuracy at all, but about society's terror of women who reject softness, who become executioners instead of nurturers. And so, whether or not she truly made her maids eat their own skin became secondary. What mattered was that the story was believable. That belief, in the end, is its own kind of truth. Modern descendants of her family have long since changed their names. Some moved across oceans. One branch reportedly settled in Argentina under assumed identities. Another sought refuge in a convent in southern France, cutting all ties to the bloodline. One woman, a great dash, Grandniece, became a nun and took a vow of silence for over 30 years. Her journals, found after her death, contain repeated entries. The mirror dreams again. She watches me. I am not her. I am not her. Today, the mirror has become her most enduring symbol. In art, in horror fiction, in cultural memory. She is the queen who stares back, the reflection that doesn't blink. In countless adaptations, films, operas, historical dramas she appears, draped in red velvet, pale hands curled like talons, eyes heavy with disdain. She's the nightmare that wears perfume. Her story has inspired novels, graphic novels, experimental theater. One avant-garde troupe once performed a silent play about her life, entirely lit by candlelight. Audiences reportedly walked out shaken, some refusing to speak for hours afterward. Another museum exhibit tried to recreate her tower chamber. It had to be shut down within 3 weeks. Visitors complained of dizziness, nightmares, and one woman fainted after claiming the portrait's eyes had moved. So what is her legacy, truly? Is she simply a relic of sadism, a symptom of a broken aristocracy that allowed a damaged woman to inflict her torment on others? Or is she a cautionary tale in the flesh, a reminder of what happens when unchecked authority meets psychological decay? Her cruelty was not impulsive. It was methodical, calculated, precise. There was a ritualistic nature to it, a ceremonial repetition that turned punishment into pageant. And perhaps that's what makes her unforgettable, not just that. She was cruel, but that she made cruelty beautiful. That her victims were silenced by lace, their suffering drowned in music, their tears unseen beneath chandeliers. One final myth remains. They say that somewhere, perhaps in the ruins of her summer palace, or buried beneath a forgotten convent there, is a mirror, not ornate, just simple, oval, and cracked. It was the last thing she gazed into before her death. Legend claims that anyone who stares into it sees not themselves, but her, not her face, but her eyes, as though she never truly left, as though she found a way to live inside the gaze of others. And maybe that's where she truly rules now, not over lands or people, but over fear itself. So, if you ever find yourself walking past a mirror late at night, and your reflection seems a little slower to follow, don't look too closely. Don't speak her name. Don't let her in, because some queens leave behind heirs, others leave behind empires. But this queen, she left behind something worse, a legacy you can't unsee.